Hello, my good friends. How are you today? May God bless you all. Imagine this, a stormy night in Chicago, rain pounding the streets like it's trying to wash the city away. Inside a rundown little gallery, a broke artist named Sophie Carter is scribbling away her worries, until a kid in a wheelchair rolls in, silent, staring at a painting like it's his whole world. One pencil, one shaky line, and everything changes. But here's the kicker. That kid's dad is James Brooks, a billionaire who doesn't trust anyone, and his mom. She'd do anything to keep Sophie out. What happens when a nobody crashes into a world of money, secrets, and broken trust? Will Sophie save them? Or get crushed trying? Buckle up, because this story's got twists, heart, and a fight you won't see coming. Hit play and let's dive in. The rain came down hard that night, a relentless Chicago downpour that turned the streets into rivers and the city into a blur of headlights and neon. Inside Blue Line Gallery, a cramped little art spot tucked between a dive bar and a pawn shop on West Division Street, Sophie Carter stood behind the counter, her fingers smudged with charcoal. She was doodling on the corner of an old receipt, swirling lines that didn't mean much, just something to keep her hands busy while her mind wrestled with the latest hospital bills stuffed in her pocket. Her mom's heart wasn't getting any better, and the numbers on that crumpled paper were starting to feel like a countdown. The gallery was dead. No surprise there. Who'd brave this weather just to stare at paintings in a place that smelled like turpentine and regret? The wind howled outside, rattling the windows like it was trying to claw its way in. Sophie sighed, brushing a strand of brown hair out of her eyes, and glanced at the clock. 8:47 p.m. Another hour before she could lock up and trudge back to her South Side apartment, where the heat barely worked and the fridge was mostly empty. That's when she saw him. He was just there, a kid, maybe 11, sitting in a wheelchair near the middle of the room, his dark hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. His clothes, a gray hoodie and faded jeans, were soaked through, clinging to his small frame like a second skin. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. His eyes, big and bright and a little lost, were locked on a painting hanging on the far wall, Storm's Edge, a chaotic swirl of blues and greens, a field caught in the grip of an oncoming tempest. Sophie hadn't heard the door chime over the rain's drumming, hadn't even noticed him roll in. But there he was, a shadow under the dim glow of the gallery's cheap lights, staring like that canvas held the answer to something he couldn't name. "Hey," she said softly, wiping her hands on her paint-stained jeans as she stepped out from behind the counter. "You like that one, huh? It's my favorite too." The boy flinched, just a twitch, like he'd been yanked out of a dream. His gaze flicked to her, then back to the painting. He didn't say a word. Up close, she could see his face better, pale, delicate, framed by that messy, wet hair. There was something in his expression, a mix of longing and quiet, like he was holding his breath, afraid to let it go. Sophie nodded at the painting. "I love how it feels alive, you know? Like you can hear the wind if you listen close enough." Still nothing. She hesitated, then grabbed her sketchbook from the counter, a beat-up thing with bent corners and coffee stains, and a stubby pencil. She crouched down beside him, her knees popping from too many hours on her feet. "You ever draw?" A beat of silence. Then, slowly, he shook his head, his eyes darting to her hands like he wasn't sure what she was offering. "Want to try?" She flipped the sketchbook open to a blank page and held out the pencil. He stared at it, his fingers twitching against the armrests of his chair. For a long moment, he didn't move. The rain tapped a steady rhythm against the glass, the only sound between them. Then, with a shaky breath, he reached out. His hand trembled as it closed around the pencil, loose at first, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to take it. Sophie smiled, small and encouraging. "Go on. It doesn't have to be good. Just let it out." He pressed the tip to the page. The first stroke was faint, barely a whisper of graphite. Then another, a little bolder. Lines started to form, jagged, searching, like he was feeling his way through the dark. Sophie watched, her breath catching as his hand moved faster, the hesitation melting away. He leaned in, his brows furrowing in focus, and for the first time that night, the room felt warm. She didn't notice the man watching from the shadows. James Brooks stood near the back wall, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his black overcoat, his sharp jaw tight as he took in the scene. He'd come to pick up Ethan after the kid slipped out of the car during a stop. Something about needing air, needing space. James hadn't expected to find him here, let alone like this. Alive, moving, creating. His son, who hadn't spoken more than a sentence in weeks, was drawing. And this woman, Sophie, according to the name tag, pinned crooked on her shirt, had made it happen. The next morning, Sophie's phone buzzed on her chipped nightstand, pulling her out of a restless sleep. She squinted at the screen, an unfamiliar number flashing against the cracked glass. Hello? Ms. Carter, this is Rachel from Brooks Enterprises. Mr. Brooks requests a meeting. 10 a.m., Brooks Tower. Can you make it? Sophie sat up, her heart thudding against her ribs. Brooks Tower? Everyone in Chicago knew that name. James Brooks, the real estate king who owned half the skyline. Why the hell did he want to see her? She mumbled a "yeah, sure," and hung up, her mind racing as she threw on her least wrinkled jacket and headed downtown. The tower was a beast of glass and steel, rising over Michigan Avenue like it owned the city. The lobby smelled like money, polished marble, fresh lilies, the faint hum of wealth in every clipped step of the staff. A sleek assistant led her to an office on the 40th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed a gray, sprawling Chicago. James Brooks turned from the view as she walked in, his presence hitting her like a cold wind. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored black suit, he looked every bit the billionaire she'd seen in Crane's Chicago business. His eyes, gray and piercing, locked onto hers. "Ms. Carter," he said, voice smooth but firm. "Please, sit." She hesitated, then sank into the leather chair across from his desk, her thrift store sneakers squeaking against the floor. You're probably wondering why you're here," he continued, settling into his own seat. She nodded, her throat dry. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. "The boy you met last night? Ethan. He's my son. He doesn't open up to anyone, Sophie. Not me, not his mom, not the damn therapists I've paid a fortune for. Last night he did. With you." He paused, letting the words hang. "I need you to keep that going. Teach him. At my place. 3 times what you're making now." Her jaw dropped. 3 times? She could barely cover rent and ramen, let alone her mom's meds. This was a lifeline. A crazy, terrifying lifeline. "I'm no teacher, Mr. Brooks," she said, shifting in her seat. "I'm just me." "That's exactly why you're here," he replied, his gaze steady. "Say yes, and you start tomorrow." The Brooks estate on Lakeshore Drive was a world away from Sophie's crumbling apartment. It wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of wealth, all gleaming wood and glass, with art lining the walls like silent sentinels. The air smelled of lavender and polish, but it felt heavy, like every room was holding its breath. A housekeeper ushered her inside, her heels clicking against the hardwood, and Sophie clutched her sketchbook tighter, feeling the weight of every stare. The butler by the stairs, the maid dusting a vase, the security guy who didn't even blink. Then there was Maya Brooks. Ethan's mom stood at the top of the grand staircase, her thin frame wrapped in a silk blouse, her dark hair pulled tight. She didn't say a word at first, just watched Sophie with eyes that could cut glass. When she finally spoke, it was a whisper to the housekeeper, loud enough for Sophie to hear. Another gold digger sniffing around. How long before she's gone? Sophie's stomach twisted, but she kept her chin up. She wasn't here for Maya. She was here for Ethan. Meanwhile, across town in River North, Derek Hayes sipped a whiskey at an art opening, his sharp grin widening as a gallery owner mentioned Sophie's new gig with the Brooks family. Derek, tall, slick, with a smirk that hadn't changed since he'd screwed her over in art school, set his glass down. Well, well, he muttered. Time to remind her where she belongs. The Brooks estate smelled like money and secrets, a mix of lavender air freshener and the faint tang of oil paint that clung to the walls. Sophie had been coming here for a week now, hauling her beat-up sketchbook and a bag of dollar store art supplies up the winding driveway of Lakeshore Drive. The place was a palace, marble floors that echoed her footsteps, chandeliers dripping light like they were crying diamonds, and windows so big you could see the choppy waves of Lake Michigan slamming against the shore. But it wasn't the luxury that got under her skin. It was the quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like everyone was waiting for something to break. Ethan was waiting for her in the art room, a sunny space at the back of the house with a view of the lake. He was parked by the easel, his wheelchair angled toward a blank canvas, his small hands folded in his lap. The kid had started opening up little by little, first with shy nods, then with questions about colors and shading. Yesterday, he'd even smiled, a quick flash of teeth when Sophie told him his sketch of a stormy sky looked like something out of a comic book. Today, though, he was different. His shoulders were hunched, his dark eyes fixed on the floor. "Hey, bud," Sophie said, dropping her bag and pulling up a stool beside him. "What's cooking in that head of yours? Ready to paint something wild?" He didn't look up. "I guess," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, trying to catch his eye. "You guess?" "Come on. You're the guy who made that killer storm last time. What's up?" That's when Liam Parker burst in, all freckles and energy, his sneakers squeaking on the hardwood. Ethan's best friend, and maybe his only friend, lived a few houses down and popped in whenever he could. "Yo, Ethan, you gotta see the waves out there. They're huge. Too bad you can't run around and paint 'em like me, huh?" Liam grinned, oblivious, tossing a football between his hands. Ethan's face went tight, his fingers curling into fists. Sophie opened her mouth to say something, but it was too late. He grabbed the paintbrush off the table, stabbed it into the canvas, and dragged it down hard, red paint streaking like blood. Then he threw it, the brush clattering across the floor as he shoved his wheelchair back. "What's the point?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm stuck like this. I can't do anything." The room went still. Liam froze, the football dropping with a dull thud. Sophie's heart sank. She'd seen that look before, on her mom's face after the diagnosis, on her own in the mirror when the bills piled up. She slid off the stool, kneeling in front of Ethan. "Hey," she said, soft but firm. "It's okay to be mad. I get it. But don't let it stop you." He glared at her, tears welling up. "You don't get it. Everyone looks at me like I'm broken." "You're not broken," she shot back. "You're pissed off, and that's fine. You've got hands, a heart, and a hell of a lot to say. Use it." She picked up the brush, wiped it on her jeans, and held it out. "Come on, paint it out." He stared at her, breathing hard, then snatched the brush. The strokes came fast, angry reds and jagged blacks, a mess of emotion spilling onto the canvas. Sophie stayed quiet, watching him wrestle with it, until the lines softened into something raw but real. When he finally stopped, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes were clearer. Liam shuffled over, scratching his head. Sorry, man. That looks dope, though." Ethan didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Progress. That night, everything went to hell. Sophie was in the Brooks private gallery, a long room lined with paintings worth more than her whole life. She'd stayed late to clean up after Ethan's session, her hands still smudged with paint as she wandered the space, admiring the collection. The air was cool, the kind of hush you only get in places too rich for noise. She paused in front of a small canvas near the back. A woman's work, judging by the signature. Maya Brooks, 2008. It was a soft piece, all muted yellows and gentle curves, nothing like the cold woman Sophie had met. She wondered what had changed. Then she heard it, a sharp rip, like fabric tearing. She spun around just as the lights flickered, and there it was. Maya's painting, slashed to ribbons on the floor. Red paint dripped from the cuts, pooling on the polished wood. Sophie's stomach dropped. "What the—" Footsteps echoed behind her. James Brooks stormed in, his face a mask of fury, with Maya right behind him, her silk blouse pristine, but her eyes wild. A housekeeper hovered at the door, pointing. "She was the last one here, sir. I saw her." James's gaze locked onto Sophie, cold and unyielding. "Tell me you didn't do this." "I didn't." Sophie's voice shook, her hands trembling as she stepped back. "I swear, I was just—" "She's lying," Maya cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. "Look at her hands, covered in paint. She's been sniffing around our things since day one. Get her out of our house, James." Sophie's chest tightened. She glanced at her hands, red smudges from Ethan's outburst earlier, damning evidence in the wrong light. "This is crazy," she said, meeting James's stare. "I didn't touch it. But you've already made up your mind, haven't you?" He didn't flinch. "Get your stuff and go," he said, low and final. "We're done here." She wanted to scream, to fight, but the weight of his words pinned her in place. She grabbed her bag and stormed out, the housekeeper's whispers trailing her like smoke. Knew she was trouble. The rain hit her face as she stumbled onto Lakeshore Drive, soaking her through, but she barely felt it. Her phone buzzed. Ethan, texting. "Why'd you leave?" "Dad's mad. Come back." She couldn't answer. Not yet. By morning, Chicago was buzzing. Tina Morales, a shark of an art reporter with a nose for scandal, had gotten wind of the mess. Her piece hit the web at dawn. Unknown artist caught in Brooks scandal, sabotage or setup. Sophie read it on her cracked phone screen, curled up on her lumpy couch in her South Side apartment. The words burned. Sophie Carter, a nobody painter, allegedly trashed a priceless Brooks family piece. Sources say she's been cozying up to the air for weeks. The room spun. She tossed the phone onto the coffee table, where it landed next to a stack of unpaid bills. $3,000 for her mom's meds, due yesterday. Her hands shook as she ran them through her hair, the rain still dripping from her jacket onto the floor. She could hear it now, pattering against the broken window she'd taped up with a trash bag. This was her life, falling apart faster than she could patch it. Maybe they're right, she muttered to herself, her voice cracking. Maybe I don't belong anywhere near their world. She thought of Ethan, his small hands gripping that brush, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only one who saw him. And now? Now she was nothing but a headline. Across town, in a dim bar in River North, Derek Hayes smirked over his third whiskey. He'd slipped into the Brooks estate last night, a favor for Maya, who'd promised him a fat check and a shot at a solo show. The painting was collateral damage. Sophie was the real target. He'd hated her since art school, when she'd beaten him in a contest only for him to steal her spot with a well-placed lie. "Payback's a bitch," he said to the empty glass, tipping it back. Back at the estate, Ethan sat in his room, staring at the ruined canvas Sophie had left behind. He didn't know what to believe, But he knew one thing. She'd never hurt him. He wheeled to the door, his jaw set. "Dad's wrong," he whispered. "I'm gonna fix this." Sophie Carter wasn't the type to give up, but damn if she didn't feel like it. The rain had stopped, leaving Chicago slick and gray, the kind of morning where the city looked hungover. She sat on her sagging couch, staring at the cracked phone screen still glowing with Tina Morales' hit piece, "Unknown Artist Caught in Brooks Scandal." Her mom's hospital bills glared at her from the table. $3,000 she didn't have, a ticking clock she couldn't outrun. But it wasn't the money keeping her awake. It was Ethan's text. "Come back." She'd let him down, and that hurt worse than anything. She couldn't sit still anymore. Grabbing her jacket, still damp from last night, she headed for Wicker Park, a hipster neighborhood buzzing with art studios and overpriced coffee shops. Derek Hayes worked out of a rented space there, a grimy loft he bragged about on Instagram like it made him Picasso. Sophie had a hunch, a gnawing feeling that the smug bastard was behind the ruined painting. If she was going down, she wasn't going without a fight. The studio smelled like turpentine and stale beer, a mess of canvases and half-empty paint tubes scattered across the floor. Neon light from a bar across the street flickered through the window, casting jagged shadows. Derek was there, slouched over a table, brushing red onto a canvas that looked too familiar, too much like Maya's painting. Sophie's pulse kicked up. She slipped her phone out, hit record, and stepped into the light. "Well, well," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her gut. "You did it, didn't you? For her." Derek's head snapped up, his sharp grin faltering for a split second before sliding back into place. He was all angles, tall, lean, with a mop of blonde hair and a leather jacket that screamed trying too hard. "Hey, Soph," he drawled, setting the brush down. "What brings you to my little kingdom?" "Cut the crap," she snapped, stepping closer. "You trashed that painting to frame me. For Maya." He tilted his head, smirking like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Maya paid me good, Soph. Cash and a solo show at her buddy's gallery. You were always too soft for this game. Thought you'd roll over and disappear." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Guess I underestimated you." "Yeah," she said, holding up her phone, the red recording dot glaring. "You did. Game's over now." His smirk vanished. He lunged for the phone, but she yanked it back, darting around the table. "Don't even try," she warned, her heart pounding. "I've got it all saved. You're done." Derek froze, his jaw tight, and she bolted out the door, the cold air hitting her like a slap. She had proof. Now she just needed James to listen. Back at the Brooks estate, the air was thick enough to choke on. James stood in the living room, the fireplace crackling behind him, its orange glow dancing across the hardwood. Maya paced in front of him, her silk blouse wrinkled, her dark hair falling loose from its perfect bun. Ethan was upstairs, locked in his room, refusing to come out since Sophie left. James had called Maya down to talk. Something about the way she'd jumped on Sophie last night didn't sit right. Sophie burst in, unannounced, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. The housekeeper tried to stop her, but she pushed past, holding her phone like a weapon. "James, you need to hear this." He turned, his gray eyes narrowing. "You've got some nerve coming back here." "Just listen," she said, hitting play. Derek's voice crackled through the speaker. "Maya paid me good, Soph. You were always too soft." The room went dead silent, the only sound the hiss of the fire. Maya stopped pacing, her face draining of color. James's gaze shifted to his wife, slow and deliberate. "Maya?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, her hands trembling. She swallowed, then exploded. "I did it for Ethan. You never saw how she was taking him from me, James. That little nobody waltzing in here, acting like she belonged. I couldn't stand it. You couldn't stand him being happy, James said, his voice low and dangerous. You hired that punk to ruin her, to ruin us. Get out. Maya's eyes widened. What? Out, he repeated, stepping toward her. Now! She stared at him, tears streaking her face, then grabbed her purse and stormed out, the front door slamming like a gunshot. Sophie stood there, breathless, but James wasn't done. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. That recording proves Derek did it. Doesn't mean I trust you. Her stomach twisted. James, I just want Ethan to be okay. That's all I've ever wanted. He studied her, his jaw tight. I don't know what to believe anymore. Stay away from him. She left, defeated, the weight of his words crushing her. Upstairs, Ethan pressed his ear to the door, hearing every word. His hands clenched. He wasn't letting this go. 2 nights later, Blue Line Gallery was alive for the first time in months. Sophie had spent every spare minute pulling it together, a secret exhibit of Ethan's work, a dozen canvases she'd salvaged from their lessons. She'd called in favors, begged the owner, Lydia Grant, to let her use the space. Lydia, a tough old broad with a soft spot for Sophie, had caved. Kid, you're nuts, but go for it. The room was packed. Local artists, a few curious neighbors, even a couple of critics sipping cheap wine. Ethan's paintings glowed under the lights, stormy skies, jagged reds, quiet blues fading into hope. Sophie stood by the door, nerves buzzing, watching strangers murmur over Ethan's art. He'd rolled in an hour ago, pushed by Liam, his face a mix of pride and fear. You think they'll like it? He'd whispered. They already do, she'd said, squeezing his shoulder. Then James walked in. He loomed in the doorway, his black coat dripping from a fresh drizzle, his eyes scanning the crowd. Sophie's heart sank. He strode toward her, his voice cutting through the chatter. What the hell do you think you're doing, Sophie? The room hushed. She squared her shoulders. Showing the world what Ethan can do. You had no right, he snapped, stepping closer. This stops now. No, it doesn't! Ethan's voice rang out small but fierce. He wheeled forward, pushing past Liam, his hands gripping the rim so tight his knuckles went white. Dad, stop. She believes in me. You never did. James froze, his breath catching. The crowd shifted, eyes darting between them. Ethan's chest heaved, his dark hair falling into his face. You think I'm weak, that I need you to hide me. Sophie didn't. She saw me. Sophie's throat tightened. She looked at James, his face a storm of guilt and shock. He's right, she said quietly. He's stronger than you know. Tina Morales slipped in, notebook in hand, already scribbling. By morning, her headline would scream, Brooks Ayres' secret exhibit, triumph or exploitation. But right now, none of that mattered. James stared at his son, then at Sophie, the fight draining out of him. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked out, leaving the gallery buzzing. Ethan rolled up to Sophie, his eyes bright. Thanks, he whispered. She smiled, ruffling his hair. Anytime, bud. But outside, James sat in his car, the rain streaking the windshield, his hands gripping the wheel. He'd been wrong, about Sophie, about Ethan, about everything, and he didn't know how to fix it. The sun dipped low over Chicago, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink as it sank behind the skyline. Inside the Brooks estate, the art room glowed with that late afternoon light, spilling through the tall windows and warming the hardwood floor. Sophie sat cross-legged beside Ethan, their sketchbooks spread out like a battlefield of colors, blues and greens swirling together, a chaos of paint and pencil marks. Ethan gripped a brush, his small hands steady now, tracing bold lines across the canvas. It was a family portrait, him, James, and a faint outline where Maya used to be. He didn't talk much today, just painted, but the quiet felt different, peaceful. Sophie dipped her own brush into a pot of ochre, adding a soft glow to the edge of Ethan's sky. "That's coming along awesome, bud," she said, tilting her head to study his work. "You've got a real knack for this." He glanced at her, his dark eyes thoughtful. "You think people will like it?" She smiled, wiping paint off her cheek with the back of her hand. "That's not the real question. Do you like it?" Ethan paused, his brush hovering over the page. He smudged a bit of blue into the green, blending it into something new, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do." "Then that's all that matters," she said, leaning back on her hands. "Art's not about them. It's about you." From the doorway, James Brooks watched in silence. He'd meant to head out, another meeting downtown, another deal to close, but his feet wouldn't move. He stood there still in his black suit, tie loosened like he'd fought a war with it. Ethan's small shoulders were relaxed, his usual guarded hunch gone, brush moving like it was an extension of him. James hadn't seen his son like this in years, not since the accident, not since the world shrank to hospital rooms and whispered pity. And Sophie? She sat there, paint smeared and steady, like she belonged. Ethan looked up suddenly, catching his dad's eye. He didn't flinch the way he used to, didn't shrink back. Instead, he grinned. A small, real grin. "Dad, you want to paint with us?" James blinked, thrown off. He'd built an empire, stared down boardrooms full of sharks. But this simple ask from his kid, felt bigger than all of it. Sophie glanced at him, her brown eyes warm but unreadable, a smirk tugging at her lips. "No pressure," she teased, sliding a blank page his way. "But let's see if the great James Brooks has an artistic side." He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You're trouble, Carter." But he stepped forward, shedding his jacket and lowering himself onto the floor beside them. Ethan handed him a brush, and Sophie pushed a tray of paints closer. James dipped it into black, safe, controlled, then hesitated. "What am I even doing here?" "Whatever you want," Sophie said, shrugging. "Just don't overthink it." He dragged the brush across the page, a shaky line at first, then broader strokes, dark waves crashing against a shore. Ethan leaned over, adding a splash of red, and Sophie laughed, tossing in a streak of yellow. It was a mess, but it was theirs. For the first time in years, James felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't known was there. Later that night, Sophie sat in James's study, a room that smelled of leather and old books, the kind of place where deals were made and secrets kept. He'd asked her to stay after Ethan went to bed, and now he stood by the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling against the dark. She perched on the edge of a chair, her sneakers scuffing the rug, waiting. "I was wrong about you," he said finally, his voice low, raw. He turned, meeting her gaze. "I'm sorry, Sophie, for everything." She froze, the words hitting harder than she'd expected. "You don't have to say anything, Mr. Brooks. I get it. You believed what made sense to you." He raked a hand through his hair, exhaling. "That's not good enough. You didn't just teach Ethan to paint. You gave him something I couldn't. Hope. I should have trusted you." She set her sketchbook down, her fingers tightening around it. "It's not about me. It's about him." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But he still needs you. And I—" He paused, like the next part was hard to get out. "I'm not asking you to stay just for him. I want you to run the new Brooks Gallery downtown, not just one spot, all of them. You see art differently, Sophie. You see what it can do, not just what it is." Her breath caught, A gallery job? Not just a job, a chance to build something, to lift up artists like her, the ones scraping by in the shadows. It was more than she'd ever dreamed, but it scared her too. That world, James's world, was ruthless, full of knives she didn't know how to dodge. She glanced at the window, her mind racing. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "Take your time," he said, his tone softer than she'd ever heard it. "But I meant what I said. You don't just belong here. You could change it." She swallowed, nodding slowly. For years, she'd fought to be seen, to matter. Now, James Brooks was handing her a seat at the table, not as a guest, but as someone who could rewrite the rules. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to say yes. The next morning, Sophie's phone buzzed on her nightstand, pulling her out of a dream about paint and storms. She grabbed it, squinting at the screen. A text from an unknown number. It was a photo. A half-finished canvas, soft yellows and greens, signed Maya Brooks. Below it, a message. "I'm finding myself again. Tell Ethan I'm sorry." Sophie stared at it, her chest tight. Maya was gone, but maybe not forever. She texted Ethan the photo, adding, "She's still out there, bud. She loves you." He replied with a thumbs-up emoji, and she smiled. Progress. Then another call came. Her mom's doctor. "Sophie, the surgery went great. She's awake, asking for you." Tears stung her eyes as she laughed, relief flooding her. She'd made it. They'd made it. That afternoon, she stood outside Blue Line Gallery, the rain long gone, the air crisp and new. Chicago stretched out in front of her, gritty, loud hers. She thought of Ethan's grin, James's shaky brushstrokes, her mom's voice on the phone. She hadn't set out to change anyone's life, just to keep her own afloat. But somewhere along the way, she'd done more. She'd drawn a line between a lonely kid and his dad, between a broke artist and a shot at something bigger. And that was enough. James pulled up in his sleek black car, Ethan waving from the back seat. "You coming?" James called, a rare half-smile on his face. "Yeah," she said, hopping in. "Let's see where this goes." Life's funny like that. Sometimes the smallest things, a kid picking up a brush, a woman saying yes when she's scared, can ripple out and change everything. Sophie didn't need James's money or Maya's approval. She just needed Ethan to believe in himself, and maybe, just maybe, she'd help James believe in something too. Kindness isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, a hand reaching out when no one else will. And in a city like Chicago, where the wind cuts deep and the nights are long, that's what keeps us going. Not what we take, but what we give. And that's a wrap, folks. What did you think of Sophie's journey? Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Did James redeem himself? How about Ethan? I read every single one, so let's chat. Thanks for sticking with me. This one's for you.